The tiny German Shepherd puppy didn't just wander into the Brooksville police station. He collapsed against the heavy doors with a desperation that silenced every veteran officer inside, pressing his mud-caked paws together in a human-like prayer for mercy. His ribcage, visible beneath a matted coat, shuddered with a plea that no badge or bulletproof vest could ignore. Before we uncover the heartbreaking secret this little messenger was sent to reveal, please subscribe to the channel and follow this journey to the very end. Comment with the city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story of courage travels. The morning at the Brooksville station began with the usual clatter of ceramic mugs and the rhythmic, hollow tapping of reports being typed into aging keyboards. Stephen sat at his desk, the steam from his coffee rising like a ghost in the gray morning light. He was a man who lived by the silence between the words, a veteran who had learned that the most dangerous things in this town were the details everyone else ignored. Across the room, Hazel adjusted her crisp uniform, her eyes bright with a rookie's hunger to prove she belonged in a world of hardened men and cold facts. The laughter of the younger officers, clunky and loud over a morning joke, died an unnatural death the second the front door groaned on its hinges. It wasn't a citizen reporting a stolen bike or a neighbor's quarrel. It was a fragment of a nightmare standing on the polished linoleum. A German Shepherd puppy, so thin his skin seemed draped over a skeleton, stared at the room with eyes that didn't belong to an animal. Is that a stray?" one officer muttered, his hand freezing halfway to his holster, as if he were facing a threat he couldn't name. The puppy didn't bark. He didn't whine. He walked with a staggering, focused purpose toward the center of the room, his tiny claws clicking like a countdown against the tile. He stopped directly in front of Stephen's desk and did the impossible. He sat back on his haunches, lifted his trembling front paws, and pressed them together in a perfect, desperate prayer. "He's begging," Hazel whispered, her voice cracking as she stepped closer, her heart clenching at the sight of the creature's ribs vibrating with every shallow breath. Stephen didn't move. His coffee hung motionless, his instincts screaming that this wasn't an act of hunger, but a summons. He reached out, his broad shoulders tensing as he lowered himself to the floor, meeting the puppy's gaze at eye level. "What do you need, little guy?" Stephen asked, his voice low, steady, stripped of the professional armor he wore like a second skin. The puppy shivered, leaning forward just enough to rest a single mud-stained paw into Stephen's open palm. The contact felt like a message, a jolt of raw urgency that bypassed reason. "He's just a dog, Stephen. Give him some scraps and call animal control," the captain barked from the center of the room, though his own eyes lingered on the pup longer than his words suggested. "He didn't come here for food, Captain," Stephen countered, his jaw tightening as the memory of his childhood dog, Max, surfaced. A dog that wouldn't stop barking until it led Stephen to his unconscious sister. "He's asking for something else. He chose us." "You're letting a stray run the station now?" Another officer sneered, masking his own discomfort with a jagged laugh. "We have paperwork. We have real crimes. We don't have time for a prayerful puppy." Hazel squared her shoulders, standing firm beside Stephen, her voice cutting through the rising skepticism. "What if he's not just hungry? Look at his eyes. He's not lost. He's leading us." The puppy let out a sharp, high whine, his body twisting toward the door, his claws scratching frantically at the floorboards. He looked back at Stephen, then at the door, repeating the cycle with an insistence that made the room feel too small. "Show us," Stephen whispered, and the shift in the air was immediate. The routine of Brooksville was dead, replaced by a thread of tension that pulled at every soul in the room. The captain exhaled, a long, measured sound of surrender. "All right, Stephen, you lead. If this is a wild goose chase, it's on your head." Stephen rose, the pup's trust pressing against his chest like a lead weight. He didn't need a badge or a gun for what was coming. As Hazel pulled open the door, the puppy bolted into the daylight, his tiny paws striking the pavement with a speed born of a terrifying necessity. The town of Brooksville watched in stunned silence as a line of uniformed officers, boots striking the pavement in disciplined unison, followed a mud-stained puppy through the narrow streets. Shopkeepers froze, groceries were forgotten on sidewalks, and children stopped their play as the odd parade marched past. "Where are they going?" a woman whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the puppy splash through puddles, constantly glancing back to ensure the humans were still behind him. The puppy turned sharply into a narrow, weed-choked lane in the oldest part of town, where the buildings sagged under the weight of decay and the air smelled of wet rot. "This is the cursed house," Hazel whispered, her breath hitching as they reached a yard overgrown with waist-high grass and shards of broken glass. The structure before them was a warning carved in gray boards and peeling paint, its windows yawning like hollow, jagged eyes. The puppy threw himself at the warped front door, his cries turning into sharp, desperate whimpers that tore through the officer's remaining hesitation. Stephen placed a hand on the door, the wood feeling damp and brittle, cold as if it had soaked up decades of shadows. He looked at the puppy, whose body was vibrating with an urgency that left no room for doubt. "We go in together," the captain ordered, his voice low as the door groaned open, exhaling a heavy, stale breath of mildew and secrets. Flashlights pierced the gloom, revealing wallpaper curling like dead skin and dust motes spinning in the beams like disturbed ghosts. The puppy darted ahead, weaving through overturned furniture and broken glass, his ears twitching at sounds the officers couldn't yet hear. "There's something here," Stephen murmured, his pulse matching the frantic rhythm of the dog's paws. The puppy barked once, a thin sound that cracked against the silence, and began clawing furiously at a corner where broken planks leaned against a collapsed wall. Beneath the debris, faint and muffled, came a sound that didn't belong in an abandoned house. A whimper so fragile it felt like it might break if they breathed too hard. Stephen dropped to his knees, his hands tearing at the rotted wood, his face coated in the rising dust of a tragedy they were only just beginning to uncover. Dust coated their uniforms, but Stephen didn't care. He knelt on the moldy floor, his rough hands, usually accustomed to restraining suspects, now trembling as he tore away pieces of rotted wood. The tiny puppy let out a sharp, high-pitched bark, his front paws clawing frantically at the gap as if every passing second were a life fading away. Hazel held her breath, the flashlight in her hand shaking in time with her racing heart, illuminating the anxious eyes of the colleagues surrounding her. "Careful. The floor could collapse at any moment." Captain Marlowe's voice rang out with authority, yet he couldn't hide the frantic edge in his breath. A large plank was wrenched back, sending a cloud of stinging dust into the air, and everyone froze as a deep, dark hollow beneath the house was revealed. From that deep, abyssal darkness, Faint and fragile whimpers drifted up like threads of silk, clutching at the hearts of these men of steel. "My God, there are other babies down here," Reyes choked out, his voice breaking as he saw the tiny creatures huddled together to fight the cold. The little puppy, the messenger of immense courage, didn't stop there. He bolted straight into the cellar, leading Stephen and Hazel deeper into the rot-filled darkness. The flashlight beams swept across stone walls slick with moisture. And then a horrifying scene emerged that made Stephen grit his teeth to keep from screaming. In the darkest corner of the cellar, a gaunt mother dog was chained tightly to a concrete pillar by a heavy, rusted iron chain. How could anyone be this cruel? Hazel sobbed aloud, her arms tightly clutching one of the rescued puppies, as if trying to transfer all her warmth into it. The mother dog turned her glazed, exhausted eyes toward Stephen, a gaze devoid of resentment, containing only one final plea: take her children. Stephen felt an electric jolt shoot down his spine. He understood that this wasn't just a rescue mission, but a race against death itself. The dry rattle of the iron chain against the stone pillar echoed as the mother dog tried to wag her tail one last time. A painful goodbye to the brave son who had brought hope back to this place. Stephen drew his tactical knife, his eyes burning with iron-clad resolve, vowing that this sacrifice would not be in vain. Stephen didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees in the damp soil, the rusted links of the chain biting into his skin as he reached for the mother dog's collar. "I've got you. Just hold on a little longer," he whispered. His voice was thick with a promise that felt more like a vow to his own soul. Hazel huddled beside him, her flashlight quivering as she watched the mother dog's sides heave with a final desperate effort. The metallic snap of the tactical knife against the corroded iron echoed through the hollow cellar like a gunshot. It was a sound of liberation that made the puppy bark in a frantic, hopeful rhythm. "Reyes, Parker, get the others out now! This place isn't holding!" Stephen barked. His command was sharp, stripping away the grief to make room for survival. The officers moved in a blur of synchronized urgency. They stripped off their heavy jackets to wrap the shivering, fragile bundles of life. Each man cradled a pup against his chest, feeling the tiny, frantic heartbeats thrumming against their own. "She's too weak to stand, Stephen. We have to carry her," Hazel cried out. Her hands were stained with the mud of the cellar, but her grip on the smallest pup was unwavering. Stephen slid his arms beneath the mother dog's gaunt frame. He felt her warmth fading, a shallow, rattling breath escaping her lungs as she leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're not dying in the dark. Not today." He gritted his teeth. The weight of her sacrifice pressed into his chest harder than the rotted beams above. As they retreated toward the narrow, groaning stairs, a low moan from the house's foundation sent dust showering over their heads. The puppy led the way, his tiny paws scratching at the wood, as if he were trying to pull the entire team toward the light. "Almost there. Stay with me," Stephen urged. He could feel the mother dog's eyes fluttering, her gaze fixed on the bundles held by his team. They burst through the sagging door and into the blinding brightness of the Brooksville afternoon. The sudden warmth of the sun felt like a miracle against their grime-streaked faces. The crowd of townspeople gathered in the yard fell into a deathly silence. They didn't see police officers. They saw guardians carrying the broken fragments of a tragedy. Stephen laid the mother dog onto a patch of dry grass, his hands lingering on her coarse fur as she watched her pups being laid down beside her. "You did it. You brought them home," he whispered. The mother dog gave one final, almost invisible wag of her tail before her eyes drifted shut. Hazel fell to her knees, her breath hitching as she realized the mother's heart had finally stopped. The sacrifice was complete. The puppy let out a long, raw howl that pierced the quiet of the street. It was a cry of mourning that shook the resolve of every hardened officer standing there. Stephen stood up, his jaw set and his eyes burning with a new, dangerous kind of purpose. The mission wasn't over until every life they had snatched from that cellar was safe. The silence in the yard was heavy, a suffocating weight that pressed against Stephen's chest as he stared at the mother dog's still form. The mission was supposed to be a rescue, but it felt like a funeral. "We can't just stand here. They're freezing, Stephen." Hazel's voice broke the trance, her hands trembling as she clutched the smallest pup tighter against her uniform. Captain Marlowe stepped forward, his jaw tight with a suppressed grief that made his usual authority sound raw. "To the station now. Reyes, Parker, get the heater running in the break room," he barked. The officers didn't hesitate, their boots striking the pavement in a frantic, rhythmic retreat from the cursed house. The puppy, the little guide they now called Hope, didn't stop to mourn. He bolted to the front of the line, his tiny paws scattering gravel as if he knew the warmth was a race they were currently losing. Inside the station, the routine of paperwork and cold coffee was violently swept aside. Desks were cleared of reports to make room for quilts, and the air once filled with the scratch of pens was now thick with the sound of desperate, shallow whimpers. "They're not eating. Their body temperatures are too low," Hazel cried out, her eyes glistening as she tried to press a damp cloth to a pup's mouth. Stephen knelt beside her, his broad shoulders shielding the fragile lives from the drafty hallway. "Use the heating pads from the first aid kits. We have to do it gradually, or their hearts won't take it," he commanded, his voice a low, steady anchor in the chaotic room. He felt a tug on his pant leg. Hope was there, his golden eyes wet and insistent, refusing to rest until every one of his siblings stirred. The first knock at the door came just as the sun began to dip, a sound that made every officer reach for their belt by instinct. But it wasn't a threat. An elderly woman stood there, her arms overflowing with hand-knitted blankets and a jar of warm goat's milk. "The town knows, officer. We're not letting these babies die in your break room," she said simply, her gaze lingering on the mud-streaked uniforms of the men who had been called enforcers only hours ago. The trickle of help became a flood. Shopkeepers brought heaters. A pharmacist arrived with syringes for feeding, and children stood silently by the glass, their faces pressed against the cold pane in a silent vigil for the broken family. Just as the first pup finally latched onto a bottle, a high-pitched electronic chirp echoed from the captain's desk. The forensics report on the chain found in the cellar had just cleared. Marlowe's face turned a sickly shade of ash as he read the screen, his fingers trembling on the mouse. "Stephen, this wasn't an abandoned house. The chain was bolted into that wall less than 48 hours ago," Marlowe whispered, the realization hitting the room like a physical blow. The mother hadn't been forgotten. She had been imprisoned by someone who was still out there, likely watching the station right now. Hope let out a sharp, jagged bark toward the darkened window, his hackles rising as if he could smell the predator returning to the scene of the crime. The heavy realization of the fresh iron chain chilled the station air more than the winter storm ever could. Stephen didn't just feel the weight of the badge. He felt the icy stare of a monster still lurking in the shadows of Brooksville. If that chain was bolted 48 hours ago, the person who did this is still here, Stephen whispered. His voice was a low, dangerous vibration that made Hazel look up from the fragile bundle in her arms. They weren't just abandoned. They were being kept for something. Hazel's breath hitched. She pulled Lily, the smallest pup, closer to her chest, as if her own heart could shield the creature from the predator outside. Hope suddenly let out a sharp, jagged bark toward the darkened front window. His hackles rose like a warning flare, his tiny body vibrating with an ancient, protective instinct. Captain Marlowe didn't hesitate. He grabbed his tactical jacket, shotting his eyes burning with a fury that stripped away years of administrative routine. "Reyes, Parker, lock the perimeter! No one gets in or out of this station without a warrant!" he barked. The officers moved in a blur of synchronized motion, the sound of heavy deadbolts clicking into place echoing through the room like a drum roll for a war. Stephen stood up, his hand resting on Hope's head. The dog was staring at a black SUV idling across the street, its headlights extinguished like a predator waiting for the lights of the station to go out. "He's here," Stephen muttered. His fingers tightened on the dog's fur, a silent vow passing between them that the mother dog's sacrifice would not be the end of this story. The tension in the room snapped when the station's back door gropped on its hinges. Hazel let out a stifled scream, her body shielding the pups on the blankets. But it wasn't a monster. It was the town pharmacist, his face pale and his hands covered in grease. "Officer, I saw him. He's at the old mill trying to load more crates," the man gasped. The news hit Stephen like a physical blow, realizing the cellar was only the beginning of a much larger, darker network of cruelty. "Take the team, Stephen. I'll stay here and guard the sanctuary," Marlowe commanded. He knelt beside the pups, his large hands reaching for a bottle of milk, with a tenderness that proved heroes aren't just born in battle. Stephen and Hope bolted into the cold night, the engine of the patrol car roaring to life with a primal scream. The chase through the narrow, rain-slicked lanes of Brooksville was a blur of adrenaline and neon shadows. "Follow the scent, Hope. Don't let him fade," Stephen urged. The puppy sat in the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the glass, barking with a frantic, guiding rhythm that led them toward the forgotten edge of town. They reached the mill just as a truck tried to peel out through the mud. Stephen didn't wait for backup. He forced his vehicle into a precision pit maneuver, the sound of grinding metal shattering the silence of the woods. The driver scrambled out, his eyes wide with a coward's panic. But before he could take a single step into the trees, Hope was there. The puppy didn't bite. He simply stood in the man's path, a tiny, mud-stained sentinel of justice. Stephen tackled the man into the dirt, the cold steel of handcuffs clicking shut, with a finality that signaled the end of a nightmare. "You forgot one thing," Stephen whispered into the man's ear, his voice like grinding stones. "You can chain a mother, but you can never break the hope she leaves behind." Back at the station, the dawn broke with a soft, golden light that painted the quilts and blankets in a glow of renewal. Hazel was still awake. Lily curled asleep against her neck. She looked up as Stephen and Hope walked through the door, her smile a fragile, beautiful thing. "They're going to make it, Stephen. The vet says they're all going to be strong," she whispered. Stephen sat down, Hope immediately curling against his boots. the dog's breathing finally slow and steady. The station was no longer a place of reports and routine. It was the heart of a town that had remembered how to care. Every pup would find a home, and every officer would carry the memory of the prayerful pause into every patrol they ever walked. Stephen looked at the empty space where the mother dog should have been, and knew her legacy was the warmth now filling the room. Justice had been served, but the true victory was the bond that now tied every neighbor to the smallest, most vulnerable among them. In the quiet of the morning, Brooksville stood as a sanctuary where no cry for help would ever go unanswered again.